Victoria Mason, Elise Stebick, and Spencer Abraham. Finally, Mr. President, at the head of this entire team is our fearless leader, our Chief of Staff, Sharon Soderstrom. Everybody on Capitol Hill and everybody in Washington knows that Sharon is one of the smartest, most dedicated, and most effective staff leaders working at any level in any branch of government. She's my first call and my last call on every subject. She was in the leader's office before I was. She supported both Trent Lott and Bill Frist. So I count my blessings on a daily basis that I am lucky, number 3. Sharon carries the weight of the world on her shoulders and not only delivers, but somehow prioritizes lightening everybody else's load while she's at it. A walking master class in leadership. I'm proud of all that we've accomplished for the country in this challenging year, and I couldn't be gladder to be heading into 2021 with these talented professionals at my side. So I thank them, Mr. President. I thank them one and all.
On the nomination, is there sufficient second? There appears to be. And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts,
You just slide it across the two and you have to.
Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz.
Thank you, perfect.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Collins, Cornyn, Kramer, Gardner, Graham, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, McConnell, Risch, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Casey, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Jones, Kelly, Schatz, Smith, Stabenow, Udall. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Reed, no, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. King, no.
Did you, I don't know.
Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Scott, Florida, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Moran, aye. I don't know. Later. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. I think I do.
Also, then it's an amendment for both of them. They should second.
Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Sinema, no.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection?
I ask
Without
the Chair to
objection.
lay before the Senate the message to accompany H.R. 133.
The Chair lays before the Senate the following message from the House.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 133 entitled An Act to Promote Economic Partnership and Cooperation between the United States and Mexico with an amendment to the Senate amendment.
I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 133.
The motion is pending.
I ask unanimous consent there be 60 minutes of debate equally divided between the leaders or their designees, and that following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on the motion to concur without further motions or amendments in order, and that 60 affirmative votes be required to adopt the motion to concur.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
The Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, North Dakota is an energy powerhouse, and our lignite producers work around the clock to ensure homes and businesses in the Midwest have affordable and reliable access to power when it's needed most. But the PTC, the wind production tax credit, is creating artificially low prices in markets for power generation. Qualified wind projects are receiving up to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour from the taxpayer. These subsidies distort the market and are forcing out the critical coal-fired baseload generation we need to keep the lights on. Since Congress established a wind production tax credit in 1992, wind power has been able to transition from an emerging technology to a multi-billion-dollar industry that is clearly commercially viable. That's why we worked on a bipartisan agreement in 2015 to phase down and sunset the wind tax credit at the end of 2019. We had an agreement to do the phase out, and the wind industry agreed to it. I worked with Senator Thune and AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association, and others to do it. And they agreed. We had an agreement. That's why we are opposed to extending the PTC and offer an amendment to strike it. We saw what happened in California over the summer, and we can't afford to have blackouts and brownouts during the coldest of winter weather months. We instead must strengthen grid resiliency and reliability by keeping diverse sources of generation available at all times, including when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. That means baseload. Instead of extending the production tax credit, we should be working on making technologies like carbon capture and sequestration commercially viable. The American Wind Energy Association states on its website that, quote, growth in the wind industry is expected to remain strong when the PTC is fully phased out. Why then are we considering another extension of this credit when the leading trade association expects to see strong growth for the wind industry without the credit? We need to bring back a level playing field for competition in our electricity markets and reverse the trend of taxpayers continuing to subsidize a mature, multi-billion-dollar wind industry. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and ensure that the wind production tax credit sunsets. And with that, I'd like to ask for some words from my co-sponsor on the amendment, Senator Kramer.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to join my colleague, Senator Hoeven, in offering this amendment and urging our colleagues to support the amendment to strip the wind production tax credit from this massive bill. Mr. President, I feel like I'm living in an episode of The Twilight Zone, and I wish I could say that I'm surprised, but I'm not, because here we go again. Despite numerous requests and appeals and deals with the leader and the chairman of the Finance Committee to not jam this body with a 13th extension of the wind production tax credit, here we are with another one in front of us. Since the credit's inception in 1992, and for a lot of those years I was a utility regulator, it has always been promised that it would be temporary and would expire. Last year we got jammed at the last minute with another extension, and rightly, the people back home are really, really upset with us. And it didn't sit very well with me either. That's why in April of this year I led a letter to Leader McConnell with colleagues from West Virginia, Wyoming, and Georgia saying it was time to finally level the playing field and get rid of this market-distorting atrocity. In July, I led another letter to Chairman Grassley with even more colleagues from West Virginia, Wyoming, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania with the same message: let this credit expire. Yet here we are again. The requests have fallen on deaf ears, and we've simply been given another bitter pill to swallow with the extension today. Some in this town have pointed to an extension in carbon sequestration credits like 45Q and 48A as if they were an equal trade. They're not. Despite years of pleading, the Treasury Department, yes, this Treasury Department, still has not finalized regulations, so an extension of 45Q is moot if there's no way to actually monetize the credit. Of equal importance, financial investors have said if renewable credits are extended, they will absorb whatever tax appetite exists because they're predictable. And those deals have been done many times. And just to reiterate, they can't even utilize 45Q because Treasury hasn't finished the regulations 3 years after Congress expanded the credit. More to the point, while there are some great proposed carbon sequestration projects planned in North Dakota, their benefit is targeted, while in contrast, hundreds of miners and local communities they built are being hurt by the extension of the production tax credit. I strongly support carbon sequester projects, but to assume that the potential benefits of 45Q or 48A are equal to the unilateral harm of the wind credit is disingenuous at best. And I've heard from utilities who actually use the wind PTC, but they said they don't need it because the market is so awash with wind credits they can't even monetize them. It's completely upside down. In fact, the PTC credits are actually taking money away from other clean energy projects like nuclear, clean coal, taking emissions-free energy right off the grid. Just a few days ago, Politico said this: the simplest option for tax extenders would be to let all 33 that are scheduled to expire at the end of the year to be renewed. I have a simpler plan. Let them all expire. K Street wouldn't like it, but it'd be one less section in this giant package. So, Mr. President, one final point. In all my time in Congress, and that's been 8 years now, the wind production tax credit has never been extended through regular order or an open discussion or even hearings. Despite our objections or promises from the wind industry that it should expire, in the 11th hour with the government shutdown looming, it gets dropped into the members' laps. That alone should be a red flag that the only time it has enough chance to pass is when it rides the coattails of our national defense and the government operations. It's shameful, Mr. President, and I support the amendment from Senator Hoeven, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. Let the wind PTC expire. I yield my time.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague, Senator Kramer, and turn to my colleague, Senator Langford.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I'll be brief. My staff did what many of us did today. We spent the day digging through a 5,600-page bill, trying to find out what's in it. We broke it up into hundreds of pages of chunks and separated among our staff and just started reading through it as quickly as we could, trying to be able to pull out the details. We found a lot of things that we really like. We found a few surprises as well. So help us, we found right in the middle of the document on tax policy a zombie, the wind production tax credit, something that we had heard had died. In fact, something that we had heard died 2 years ago. In fact, something that we had heard died 6 years ago when all of us agreed it should die. In fact, the plan was take it down a little bit each and every year until it finally got to zero. The problem was when it got to zero, some lobbyists helped somebody get it back in last year, and it suddenly, after going to zero, reappeared. And then, so help me, it reappeared again. So this temporary credit that distorts the market, that literally changes the prices and all of our energy, whether that be oil or gas or coal or solar or hydroelectric or nuclear, it gives a special perk to one, and all of the rest of them get furious, but for whatever reason, this simple credit can't seem to go away. When we agree to something, we should probably stick to it. And we agreed years ago to phase this out. But yet this zombie keeps reappearing and walking the halls of the Senate. Our simple challenge is this: let's put this zombie in the daylight. Let's have the real argument over it and determine, is this distorting the energy market for everybody else, including all of our renewables? Is it something we need to keep? Now, I live in Oklahoma, and if you know our song, you know the wind comes sweeping down the plains. We have been called the Saudi Arabia of wind power. I promise you can't drive very far in Oklahoma without seeing a field of windmills. We've got lots of wind power, and we think it's a great energy source. But it's a mature energy source, and it does not need the wind production tax credit. So let's sunset it. With that, I'd yield.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank my colleague, Senator Langford. Also, we'd like to thank Senator Lamar Alexander, Senator Barrasso, others that support this legislation. And with that, I ask unanimous consent that our motion to concur with the amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
The senator from Oregon.
Mr. President and colleagues, I am going to be brief. And I just want to give the Senate a sense of where we are with respect to this renewable energy issue. In front of us now is a bipartisan agreement to extend a variety of approaches that are going to allow us to promote greener energy that reduces carbon emissions. And when I talk to colleagues on both sides of the aisle, there's enormous support for that, enormous support for the effort to reduce carbon emissions. Now, I can look around this chamber and I can see colleagues starting over in that corner with Senator Heinrich, who has worked for years on renewable energy, and literally go around the chamber and point out colleagues who have worked with me and others on the renewable energy provisions that are part of this bipartisan agreement. This includes not just the credits for wind, but solar and renewable energy. And I would submit this is the best approach to what we have today, which is a need to make sure that critical investments are not missed out on now. Now, for the future, we do have a plan, and that is to have a technology-neutral approach that would avoid picking winners and losers and basically taking this mess of a tax code with more than 40 separate energy provisions, throwing it in the trash, and saying we're going to focus on one thing, reducing carbon emissions. We aren't there today. That's what this issue is all about. But what is here today is climate change. And that is why it is so important that we pass the legislation that is in the bill and reject this amendment. So with that, I want to say to my colleagues from North Dakota, I remember enjoying going to North Dakota for the sponsor of this amendment. I will tell you, if you're over 6 feet tall, make sure you exercise before you go to North Dakota, because you will be in the smallest airline seat in the history of aviation. But John Hoeven is a very good and caring man. I'm looking forward to working with him on these issues in the future. And, Mr. President, with that, I would object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr.
The
President.
senator from North Dakota.
I would ask my colleague from Oregon, and I did have him in North Dakota. We had a great time, and I appreciate him coming out to see the energy we produce in our great state. And I would ask the gentleman for his help on carbon capture technologies. We've put funding in place to advance those carbon capture technologies, and I ask for his help and his colleagues' help in that endeavor.
I would just say to my colleague, I'm always interested in working with him for the future. I would just say that the focus after we pass this bill, and particularly these important provisions which are going to meet immediate needs, let's just set as our lodestar reducing carbon emissions. You and I served on the Energy Committee together. That's an approach that brings together Republicans and Democrats. And with that, Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President,
Senator from North
I thank
Dakota.
my co-sponsors on this amendment, and our efforts will continue. With that, I yield the floor.
I'd note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Dispense with.
Without objection.
I ask the chair to lay before the Senate the message to accompany H.R. 1520.
The chair lays before the Senate the following message from the House.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 1520 entitled An Act to Amend the Public Health Service Act to provide for the publication of a list of licensed biological products and for other purposes, with an amendment to the Senate amendment.
I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment, and I know of no further debate on the motion.
Is there further debate? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion to concur is agreed to.
I ask unanimous consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H-Con Res. 128, which was received from the House.
The clerk will report.
House Concurrent Resolution 128, directing the Clerk of the House of Representatives to make a correction in the enrollment of H.R. 1520.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without an objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the motion be to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Majority Leader.
Senate, all time be yielded back.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The question is on the motion to concur. The yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin.
It's a wrap.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Do. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Young, Mr. Blunt, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Johnson, Lee, Hall, Scott of Florida. Mr. Cruz, no.
The yeas are 91, the nays are 7. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the motion to concur is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
I ask unanimous consent that the senior senator from South Dakota, the senior senator from Kansas, and the senior senator from Missouri be authorized to sign duly enrolled bills or joint resolutions from December 21st, 2020 through January 3rd, 2021.
Without objection.
I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.